On Primetime Politics tonight, Canada's Environment Commissioner calls for action and results after 3 decades of failure on climate promises. Jerry DeMarco will be here to discuss lessons learned and urgent next steps. Federal government unveils what it calls its last COVID support program. Who will get help and who won't? Canada's Minister of Employment will join me to talk about that. And MPs will be here to debate a return to a hybrid parliament and rising inflation. And we'll begin tonight with a new report from Canada's Commissioner of the Environment calling for action and results on climate change and detailing the failures of 3 decades of promises that have resulted in a more than 20% increase in greenhouse gas emissions, making Canada the worst climate performer in the G7. The speech from the throne this week spoke about the need for urgent action on climate change, just as Canadians feel the wrath of damaging storms both on the west and east coasts of the country. The Environment Commissioner calling for stronger leadership to drive progress, reduce dependency on high-emission industries, and more investments in climate adaptation and resiliency. The report prompted questions today in the House of Commons.
We are in the grips of a climate crisis. We're feeling the impacts of it, and we need immediate action. The Liberals claim that their fossil fuel subsidies help reduce emissions. Well, it turns out that the Auditor General has just confirmed that is not the case. In fact, they are not reducing emissions. So why won't the Prime Minister just finally end all fossil fuel subsidies and invest that public money into renewable energy and creating good jobs that help us fight the climate crisis?
Yeah. Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we agree with the Leader of the NDP, and I hope with all members of this House that climate action is urgent and essential. That's why we are committed to eliminating fossil fuel subsidies by 2023. That was in the climate plan that we ran on during the recent election campaign. And I would like to point out, with the greatest respect for all of my colleagues, that a raft of independent experts found our climate plan to be the best.
Jerry DeMarco is Canada's Commissioner of the Environment. He joins me now. Mr. DeMarco, first of all, good to see you. Thanks for taking time to speak with me. Appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Look, why has this country's performance on climate been such a failure for the past 30 years?
It's been such a failure because we've had no shortage of plans and targets, but what we've had is a shortage of action to implement those plans and targets. 30 years of 9 different plans, 4 international agreements, but no net results.
Now, you've called for stronger leadership to get real progress. So what is it you think we need to see?
So at the federal level, we need to have a plan that actually is focused on achievement of the goals in it. So we've had a series of plans over the years, and the common denominator is that we get along on them, and as it looks like we're not going to meet the targets, we start talking about the next plan and the next plan, and it just goes on and on. What we need to now focus on are results, and that's why this report has been put out, is to remind Canadians that we've had a series of plans, we've had a lot of good intentions, we just aren't getting the results.
All right,
we need results.
Okay, I want to drill down on some of these issues in just a moment, a little deeper. But let's, you talk about plans. The major political parties all campaigned on climate plans. We just had an election. Can you say which one of those plans is closest to what you think the country needs and that has a clear roadmap for achieving results?
Well, none of the current plans will achieve what's needed. Luckily, the last Parliament passed a new law requiring a new plan to meet our Paris obligation, and our Paris obligation is for a 40 to 45% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm expecting that the current federal government will come out with an improved plan either this December or by the latest by March in order to have a roadmap for meeting the Paris target.
You acknowledge in your report the continued reliance of the Canadian economy on the fossil fuel sector and how that's working against climate efforts. So what's the solution?
The solution is a just transition to a low-carbon economy. So we can't simply tell the regions of Canada that rely on fossil fuel development or processing to just, take one for the team and help Canada meet its targets. We need the federal government to provide leadership on lowering the emissions and transitioning those economies to the low carbon future. Without that, there won't be the support for the emissions reductions because people will feel like their livelihoods are being threatened by these emissions reductions.
Let me ask you,
that's the key.
And let me ask you about that. In that same context, your reporter also talks about the polarization of the conversation in this country over years on climate change, and it continues today. And some of that has to do with where the resource-producing parts of this country are located and the jobs that are involved in those in fossil fuel-producing industries. So, how do we make that conversation less polarizing so that there's, in effect, a national effort to deal with climate?
We're getting there. The public awareness of the issue and the political awareness of the issue has improved greatly just over the last 5 or 10 years. It's no longer a difficult conversation to have with someone as to the importance of dealing with avoiding catastrophic climate change. We have some hard reminders across the country just this week in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and British Columbia. I think people understand the magnitude of the problem, and I think they've been expressing that to their representatives. So now those representatives have to reflect that public will and get beyond unnecessary debate over climate change and focus on cooperating towards the common goal of saving the planet and Canadians from catastrophic climate change.
I think, if I can say so, your report as well, goes to some length to talk about what are obvious contradictions in the efforts. For instance, you refer to the government's purchase of the Trans Mountain Pipeline as policy incoherence in efforts to make progress on climate change. Tell me what you mean.
So policy coherence is necessary to affect change. That means getting everyone on the same side, working towards a common goal. Examples in our report show that sometimes Canada will create a goal, but then short-term decisions made by government or by individual departments run contrary to the goal. That's policy incoherence. In other words, two departments pushing on the opposite sides of the large rock that they're trying to push up the hill in terms of the climate change agenda. The examples in our report might account for the fact that we haven't been meeting our targets and that emissions have been going up despite individual programs that are supposed to add up to reductions.
Right.
The net effect has been negative.
Okay, so buying the Trans Mountain Pipeline, that's policy incoherence.
That's a good example, as well as the Emissions Reduction Fund, the other example in the report today.
Right. Let's talk about that. $675 million in the Emissions Reduction Fund. It was created by the federal government, I think last year it was, during the pandemic to support the oil sector when prices crashed and to help them cut emissions at the same time. You say that program didn't work. Why not?
Well, because it's called an Emissions Reduction Fund, and the department couldn't even tell us if there were net reductions in emissions. Just because there's a pandemic, it doesn't mean that you just throw money at a sector and hope that there will be net reductions in emissions. You've got to actually have the measures in place to track that. Same with their other objectives on saving jobs and increasing investment in the sector. They weren't tracking these things. You can't just subsidize an industry and hope for the best, especially when you've already committed to trying to transition to a low carbon economy. That's policy incoherence. That's working at odds with each other.
The government side pushed back on the Emissions Reductions Fund, disputed your findings. What does that tell you about this? I mean, if we've got lots of plans but no action, and you point out policy incoherence, and the response is, yeah, we don't buy what you're selling. How concerned are you about that posture?
Very disappointed at the responses from the department. I would have expected, just for this example of the Emissions Reduction Fund, even the rationale for the program, which were depressed commodity prices in the oil and gas sector, that's changed completely since they launched the program. Yet they're still continuing on, giving us responses that are non-committal. It's disappointing to see, and it's an example where these short-term expedient decisions, whether it's the Emission Reduction Fund or another example, they get in the way of our long-term goal, and getting in the way of our goal means jeopardizing our children's future.
All right, Jerry DeMarco, Canada's Commissioner of the Environment. Great to talk to you. Thanks for your time today, and we'll talk again.
Thank you, Peter.
The acting chief of the Defence Staff has been made permanent. The Prime Minister announcing today the appointment of General Wayne Eyre. Eyre replaces Admiral Art MacDonald, who stepped down last February over allegations of sexual misconduct. Military police determined there was insufficient evidence to charge MacDonald, who remains on leave.
General Eyre and I will continue to work hard in reforming the culture of the Canadian Armed Forces. We need to ensure that we have an institution where everyone who puts on a uniform feels safe and respected and protected.
Well, the first bill of the new Parliament is Bill C2. That bill provides $300 a week to workers who've lost their income because of any public health lockdowns. Wage and rent subsidies are also being extended for businesses in the tourism, culture and hospitality sectors, along with gyms and casinos and theaters, as long as they can prove they've suffered major revenue losses because of the pandemic. Carla Qualtrough is Canada's Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion, and she joins me now. Minister Qualtrough, good to see you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me.
Well, thanks for having me.
Explain who's eligible for this latest suite of government COVID supports and under what circumstances.
Okay, so there's a new suite of business supports that are more targeted than, in fact, all of these measures are much more targeted. We've moved away, we've pivoted, as the Deputy Prime Minister has said, from the broad-based approach where every business is eligible, every worker is eligible, to really reflect the economic and public health realities of today, but making sure we still support workers. So we're extending the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit and Caregiver Benefit. So any worker that can't work because they're sick or isolating with COVID, that can't work because they have caregiving responsibilities, those benefits all will continue, and we've added 2 weeks to each through next May. For workers who are otherwise kind of implicated by COVID, the main thing that's happening to workers and jobs right now that's on a negative, because as you know, we've recovered more than the number of jobs that we lost during COVID, is the potential for lockdowns. So where we see businesses being impacted and workers potentially losing their jobs is in a lockdown situation. So that's why this targeted Canadian worker lockdown benefit is being put in place, so that if anybody can't work or isn't working or has lost hours because of COVID and it's due to an imposed lockdown, they have access to the same level of benefit they had under the Canada Recovery Benefit.
All right. To be clear, this is not available to someone who might not be working, who might be out of work because they've refused to get vaccinated. That might be a condition of their employment. Is that correct?
Not at all. Why not? In fact, even if you're in a lockdown, well, it's the same logic that we need to have our workplaces safe, and we need people not going to work sick, and we need the economic and public health imperative of keeping people safe and keeping businesses open, and just the requirement that businesses are imposing of a vaccine mandate. We want to support that.
The Canadian Federation of Independent Business, I'm sure you know, has been pressing your government to change the threshold for these aid programs from the 40 to 50% minimum revenue loss requirement to just 10%. Why have you settled on the 40 to 50%?
Well, again, that's a finance question, Peter, but I'll do my best to answer. My understanding is we wanted to help businesses that have been significantly impacted over a period of time. Now, we know, for example, the tourism and hospitality support is really targeted because we know these sectors or businesses in this definition aren't recovering as quickly as other sectors, and we want to focus on them. And then the broader kind of hardest hit business requirement is really for businesses that have had an enduring, economic impact.
Okay, I mean, you've talked about these. These are more targeted, and the government, I know, is hoping
except in the situation of a lockdown.
Right.
So
okay,
any business, in a lockdown, or any worker in a lockdown has access to these.
Okay, so that's where I'm headed. How do you verify that someone's in a lockdown? People will be making applications for these, presumably from different parts of the country. How do you know who is eligible and legitimately qualified to get the payments?
Well, we spent a lot of time figuring that out, and where we landed in the legislation is it's definitely at the discretion of the local, regional, provincial health authority or whatever a system is within a province to declare a lockdown. And we have provided a definition in the legislation that we will then compare the parameters of that declaration against in order to decide, and it's through Government Council on my recommendation, that definition has been met. Non-essential services have been impacted. It's a significant, so I don't have the exact legal verbiage, so I don't want to get it wrong, but the Public Health Agency of Canada and public health agencies across the country have a very kind of consistent and well understood definition of lockdown, and we tried to mirror that as much as possible in the legislation, defined by region, more than 14 days. We tried to do our very best to mirror existing understandings that are out there.
Your government is sending a signal that this is the final support measure you'll have to offer. What if there's a bad fifth wave and cases spike and we get more lockdowns and maybe not even I suppose lockdown is the measure for this benefit, but what if we get a really bad fourth wave and people aren't going to work again?
Well, then, like every other time, absolutely we hope and we expect this to be the last one, but we pivot again, Peter, and we look at it again. People can absolutely be assured that if something hits us that we don't know is coming, then we will absolutely go back to the table and make sure workers are supported. There's no doubt in my mind that is the collective understanding of Cabinet on this.
Okay, let me ask about artists and performers. They've been hard hit and continue to be. This plan doesn't include them. Why are they not included or eligible?
Well, this particular legislation doesn't include a specific subset of workers, like you're talking about artists and people in the cultural industries. But Minister Rodriguez is working with stakeholders in that sector to figure out a way to directly support impacted artists and workers in the culture section. Again, if they're in a lockdown, they would be, but a small comfort. I appreciate that as I say it. But there is going to be a solution where we make good on our promise to support these workers. Again, I don't know how technical you want me to be, but it's actually difficult to find a list. And how do we define it? And who would the people be? And how do we pay them? And what mechanism? Is it a tax credit? Is it CRA? Is it ESDC and Service Canada? So,
but you're saying that's happening. I mean, someone's trying to figure it out.
All those conversations are happening.
All right,
sure.
And there's the other. Let's talk about seniors. I know you're dealing with this issue as well. So here's the situation, right? And all kinds of seniors who are seeing their guaranteed income supplement being clawed back, or they're not getting it at all because of the pandemic payments they received, where their income went higher and then in some cases disqualified them. So what are you doing about that? What should they expect? Should they expect that, look, the pandemic supports were taken as income, and if you took that as income, then you've taken yourself out of the eligibility for a certain level of GIS payments. So what should they expect?
Thank you for defining it so fairly, because that's exactly the complexity that we're dealing with here, is that there will be seniors whose 2020 income meant that their GIS payments were either reduced or lost. And some of those seniors, that happened because they collected CERB. But there's other seniors who worked more last year and took on extra hours during the pandemic, and so they lose or have their GIS reduced. And so for me, it's an equity issue. We're trying to figure out, some seniors tapped into their RSPs last year, and that was treated as income, and as a result, they have reduced GIS. So you can imagine a scenario where somebody worked and earned $10,000, and somebody took CERB for $10,000, and they're treated differently in terms of their eligibility for GIS this year. Right. We're working through it. It's very complicated. There's an equity piece here. There's been no final decision. I'm not in any way saying that we're not going to find a solution, but in my mind, it has to be equitable for any senior. And seniors have to be treated the same.
All right, so this is a stay tuned. So seniors,
it's a live issue.
Worried about this, or some
and I'm worried
moving
about
parts.
It. I feel very badly for people. Yeah.
Okay, Carla Qualtrough, always good to talk to you. Thanks for your time tonight.
My pleasure, Peter. Take care.
Well, Liberals and New Democrats have joined forces to pass a motion to restore hybrid sittings of Parliament, citing the safety of hybrid sittings that will allow MPs to participate remotely. The Conservatives and the Bloc call it an attempt by the government to dodge accountability.
So we don't know whether or not somebody is in here who is unvaccinated, who did not isolate, or maybe they did isolate because they won't tell us any of this.
The vote tonight is about him not being accountable to Canadians for the next 6 to 8 months. As I said, he'll go to meetings, he'll hold elections. I just left chamber where Liberals are hugging and having fun. There's no need for him to go to a hybrid session. It's irresponsible. It's the height of hypocrisy.
Let's bring in three members of Parliament now to discuss some of the key stories today. And Arif Virani is an Ontario Liberal MP. James Bazan is a Manitoba Conservative MP and the Deputy Opposition Whip for the Official Opposition. And Rachel Blaney is a British Columbia New Democrat MP and the Whip for the NDP. Good to see you all. Let's start with the virtual sittings, Mr. Virani. A return to hybrid sittings. We're being told that it will be a priority to have ministers in the chamber and the Prime Minister as well, but other MPs will be limited in numbers to allow for distancing. Why are hybrid sittings still necessary for Parliament?
Well, I think because we're trying to be realistic with the competing objectives of ensuring Parliament can function and parliamentarians can do their work, but also with the competing objective of observing public health guidelines. We know that we're not in the same place in the pandemic that we were obviously 18 months ago, but the pandemic is still with us. There are still concerns about fourth and fifth waves. People are contracting the virus. There was a member of the Conservative caucus who himself contracted the virus just this past week. We want to be able to ensure that if that happens to me, to James, to Rachel, or to any of us, that you're still able to do your work as a parliamentarian by participating virtually and still carrying that voice of your constituents into the House of Commons, but through a hybrid format.
Mr. Bazan, would your argument that the House is safe and meeting according to the rules, would that argument be bolstered if Conservatives would tell everyone in Parliament how many of their MPs are vaccinated, how many are not, some who have exemptions? What is that number? And is it right to force MPs who may have compromised immune systems to attend in person?
We're following the public health guidelines just like everybody else, and this decisions that were made by independent medical experts. We're following the guidelines from the Parliament health nurse. Everybody has met those guidelines to be in the House. And, you know, shutting down Parliament to go virtual so the Liberals can play games like we witnessed in the last Parliament where they can, you know, filibuster and suspend committee meetings at end and never get down to the business of the day and continue on with their cover-ups, isn't what we were just elected to do. You know, we were out knocking doors, canvassing our constituents, and they all elected us to have our butts in seats and standing up for their values and standing up for the issues that are of concern to them back home. So if we're going to be able to talk about all this stuff, it's important that everybody is in the chamber. Now, if somebody does get COVID, and that's possible, and we witnessed that last week when one of our vaccinated MPs actually did get sick, guess what? We can do pairing where we don't have to have everybody in the House and people can actually go back. We want people to get better. We want them to recover, and we've done it in the past when people have had
but doesn't this avoid pairing? So if you've got an MP who gets sick and has to self-isolate, they can still take part in Parliament virtually. You don't have to pair.
This only fulfills the narrative that the Liberals who want to do cover-ups and the NDP who want to stay home and not work. You know, I think we need to make sure that the institution and democracy here in Canada is protected. And the only way we can do that is that members are in the House doing their job.
Let me hear, Rachel Blaney, what's your response to that argument?
Well, I think it's really disappointing to hear a Conservative member, first of all, not indicate how many of their members are unvaccinated, and number two, make implications about any other party and the dedication that they have to this country. I believe that all parties, regardless of partisanship, are dedicated to serving their constituents, and I just want to make sure that's on the record. The reality is, when I go out into the world and do things, right now you need to show proof of vaccination to walk into the room. That's how we know we're safe. Everything that you do when you stand up and walk around, you make sure that you're wearing a mask. Right now, we're sitting in a space, and actually our public health has actually said to us that members of Parliament should keep a mask on at all times, even when speaking in the House, which is something that we are all not doing. So we have to look at this. And the other part is we are responsible as parliamentarians, not only for our members, but for the people who work for us in this building. And so when we think of all the buildings of Parliament, how they could potentially be impacted, how children under 11 who cannot be vaccinated could be impacted, that's for people all who work here who have to go home, to immunocompromised loved ones, to children under 11, and MPs. This is about public health and public safety. It is not about partisanship, but it certainly is about the lack of honesty from the Conservative
Well, that's
Party.
where we're headed to virtual sitting, so we'll keep an eye on a hybrid parliament. Mr. Varney, let me shift now to talk about the economy and more specifically the issue of inflation. What can be done about the steep rise in prices that Canadians are facing for staples? There are clearly global drivers, but the billions of dollars in government supports during the pandemic, a lot of economists say, has pushed up consumer demand. So at this point, what responsibility does your government have for dealing with rising inflation and how to do that?
Well, it is clearly a global phenomenon. We've seen that. We've seen statistics thrown around, but it is clearly a global phenomenon of which Canada is a part. But the second major point is that what we are doing and what we heard during the campaign trail and what we put in our platform and in the speech from the throne is efforts that will render life more affordable for Canadians. And the two primary features there are childcare agreements that will bring childcare costs down to $10 a day within 4 or 5 years, starting with halving the price by next year with nine provinces and territories so far. And secondly, with making housing more affordable. And that's rental housing, that's renting to own, that's making closing costs on the real estate transaction more affordable as well. Those are
so is it your view that this is
more money?
Is it your view that this is a short-term tough patch, not necessarily short-term, but this is not this will not be with us forever, and that you think Canadians will come through it in part with the support of government policies?
It very much is my view, and it's not just my view, it's also the view of Tiff Macklem, who said that we are in a transitionary period. This is something that's affecting all nations, all westernized nations, capital markets, et cetera, and it's affected by global supply chains, et cetera, and it is something that we are weathering the same way that other nations are weathering it. We are weathering it better than our southern neighbor, but marginally less well than some of our European neighbors.
Mr. Bazan, let me hear you on this. If the pandemic spending by the government is at least in part responsible for increasing inflation, would your party have spent less money with a view to keeping inflation under control as the pandemic started to wane?
We know that the money presses have been running overtime in the government of Canada. We know that the increase in dollars that are in circulation is driving a homemade, right here in Canada, inflation crisis. We know that's the same situation south of the border as well, that there's just too many dollars in circulation. And that causes people to have more to spend, and of course they're going to inflate the prices. In the G7, we are second overall. And in the world, when it comes down to looking at housing prices, we are second in the world for the highest inflation on housing at 6.7%. So it really does speak to the issue that the government policies that we have here in Canada is creating a lot of this inflation. We know that as commodity prices are increasing and as we're looking at global supply chain issues and all those things that are impacting upon Canada and the rest of the world, when the Canadian dollar gets weaker because of too many dollars in circulation, the price of all those goods and services go up.
Rachel Blaney, what role should the federal government play in dealing with inflation? What would your solutions be?
Well, this is very concerning, and we're seeing a lot of folks that are, in serious risk of not having a home. I think of the seniors across this country, the ones that were working seniors who received the guaranteed income supplement that is now, over 80,000 seniors have been told, sorry, you won't be getting your guaranteed income supplement, even though you were working, you were eligible for the program. So you look at with the decision making that we're seeing in this government. So instead of looking at the bigger corporations that made significant profit in some cases during the pandemic, making sure that they're getting taxed appropriately so that we're seeing the resources there to stabilize what we're seeing in the more vulnerable populations across Canada, it's concerning that decision-making process isn't happening. And we do need to deal with this. I think of North Island, part of my riding, where housing costs have gone up by 55%. There needs to be action taken so that there's more affordability for those folks that need it.
These are challenges for Canadians in all parts of the country. And thank you all. Our time's short tonight, but thank you all for your input and joining me for this conversation. Good to see you all again. Take care. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
And that's all for this edition of Primetime Politics tonight. I'm Peter Van Dusen. Till next time, thanks for watching.